The obese, bored man tumbled out of the factory gate and collapsed onto the grass. He trembled, holding his head high, only one eye, which had a lens, visible. He glanced back at the leisurely factory corridor behind him, then, still terrified, picked up the phone. "Secretary Liu, book me the earliest flight back home tomorrow. Yes, don't worry about anything else, just let me know when you're booked." As soon as he hung up the phone, his eyes suddenly widened in fear and he shouted in a trembling voice, "Who are you?" The morning light was faint and a light mist enveloped the town. Chen Ze, chewing a piece of pancake, his school bag swaying on his shoulder, hurried to school. "I overslept again today. If I'm late again, I'll have to stay back next week to get paid." He stopped abruptly at the intersection east of the town, staring at the rusty iron gate beside him. This was a large abandoned garden, once the busiest factory in town. A few years ago, for unknown reasons, the owner had fled, the workers had dispersed, and the factory gradually fell into disrepair. But this large garden has one advantage. If you could pass through it, you could cut the journey in half. Chen Ze hesitated, cautiously looking around. After confirming that no one was paying attention, he leaned over and peered open the large, long rusted iron lock. He pushed gently, and the iron door creaked harshly. Chen Ze almost slipped inside. Inside the factory compound, the cracked concrete floor beneath his feet, the wind blowing through, carrying with it the sound of waste paper and rags being blistered. Time seemed to have stood still here. The rusted iron bars, the mottled walls, and the collapsed roof exuding an air of decadence. Chen Ze walked along a weed-covered path, stepping on dead leaves. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something in the factory window to his left. He stopped abruptly and turned to look. A familiar figure stood in the window, staring at him frozen in time. It was Xiao Feng, his good friend Xiao Feng. Xiao Feng stood by the window, his face pale and his eyes hollow, his hands hanging at his sides like a soulless puppet. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something, but no sound came out. Chen Ze frowned and called out tentatively, "Xiao Feng?" But there was no response. Xiao Feng's expression remained motionless, only his eyes shifted slightly with Chen Ze's footsteps, never staring at him. A chill ran down Chen Ze's spine. He swallowed hard and took another step forward, trying to get a better look. However, Xiao Feng's figure suddenly flashed and disappeared into the shadows behind the window, as if he had been suddenly pulled away by some invisible force. Chen Ze took a deep breath, a strong sense of unease washing over him. He didn't have the courage to stay any longer and ran to school. However, Chen Ze didn't see Xiao Feng at school all day. The next morning, Chen Ze stepped out of his house when he saw several police cars parked on the street. Neighbors gathered, whispering, "Oh, poor boy, how could this child have disappeared?" Xiao Feng's parents hadn't returned home the previous night and had searched all night, but couldn't find him. Chen Ze was stunned, his heart aching. He hurried home and told his father about seeing Xiao Feng at the factory the previous day. His father's face fell and hurriedly dragged him to the police. However, despite a thorough search of the abandoned factory compound, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no clues at all. "Son, did you see that?" the officer asked helplessly. His father's face sank and he apologized profusely to the police. He gave Chen Ze a stern look and said, "What did I always tell you? Don't go to that weird place. What nonsense are you talking about?" Chen Ze bit his lip and tried to defend himself, but he lowered his head in the face of his father's anger. Xiao Feng's disappearance caused quite a stir in town. Some said he'd been abducted by human traffickers, others that he'd run away from home. Others whispered that the abandoned factory was in a shady state and that's why the boss had fled. Regardless, Chen Ze felt a weight of sadness.
Strange sense of unease every time he passed the abandoned factory. He didn't want to take the long way around, so he quickened his pace whenever he passed the window, not even daring to glance. He felt as if a pair of eyes were staring at him from the window. A few days later, at dusk, Chen Ze, backpack on his back, was walking briskly along the path in the abandoned factory compound. He tried not to glance at the window, but this time, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something. A familiar figure standing inside, watching him silently. Chen Ze's footsteps paused, his heart clenched. It was Jiabao, the neighbor's younger brother. His face was pale, his eyes were hollow, and he stood stiffly behind the window, his posture identical to Xiaofeng's a few days ago. Chen Ze's breathing quickened. Fighting back his fear, he called out in a trembling voice, "Jiabao, why are you there?" Behind the window, Jiabao didn't respond, as if he hadn't heard him at all. His hollow eyes stared at him intently. "Jiabao, what are you doing? Go home!" Chen Ze bravely called out again. However, just like last time, just as he took a step, Jiabao's figure suddenly vanished, as if he had never been there. Chen Ze's blood seemed to freeze in an instant. He froze in place, his lips trembling slightly, a layer of sweat on his forehead. He turned and ran, desperately rushing back home, not even daring to look back. The next morning, at dawn, Chen Ze was awakened by a commotion outside. Instinctively, he sat up and looked out the window. Downstairs on the street, the red and blue lights of police cars flashed continuously. Officers stood in groups, whispering to each other. Without even asking, Chen Ze guessed what had happened. Jiabao was missing. His legs weakened, and he ran out of the room sniffing and leaning against the doorway, quietly eavesdropping on his father's conversation with the neighbors. Last night, Jiabao's mother waited for him to come home until the early hours of the morning, but he still hadn't shown up. Then she went to the police. Could he have been abducted by human traffickers, or had he just sneaked out to play? This was the second child missing in our town. How could such things keep happening? Chen Ze's heart raced. He bit his lip, his nails digging deep into his palms. He knew full well that Jiabao wasn't lost, nor had he been abducted by human traffickers. He had been taken away through that window. But this time, Chen Ze didn't tell anyone what he had seen. He feared his father's scolding, and even more so the police's suspicion. Most importantly, he didn't dare go back to that factory. He thought that if he could just avoid that path, he could forget about it. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. When he sat down at school and reached into his school bag, his heart sank. His student ID was gone. He searched every corner of his bag, but couldn't find it. His face gradually turned pale, and his fingers began to tremble uncontrollably. He suddenly remembered that his student ID was still in his pocket when he left school last night. Could it have fallen there? His breathing quickened, his heart racing at the thought. In the evening, the setting sun dyed the sky an eerily dark red. Chen Ze stood in front of the iron gate of the factory compound, his palms wet with sweat. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He was just looking for his student ID. He'd be out of there soon. He gritted his teeth, pushed open the rusted iron gate, and slowly walked into the dilapidated courtyard that gradually swallowed his eyes. The air, ever changing, was filled with the delicious food and rusted metal. The dilapidated factory building cast dark shadows in the setting sun. Chen Ze hurried across the weed-covered path, his eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to look up at the window. But out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something. Another person in the window. He stopped abruptly, and the cold sweat on his back instantly soaked his school uniform. He stiffly raised his head, only to find himself in the window. This time, the person in the window was himself. The reflection in the glass wasn't his own.
Chen Ze's throat felt like it was clogged. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Finally, his voice struggled to break free, trembling like it wasn't his own. "Who are you?" Chen Ze and the window didn't answer. His lips trembled slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. His eyes were filled with worry and despair, as if he were trapped in some invisible cage. A chill ran down Chen Ze's spine, and he almost collapsed and turned to run. But then, the person in the window suddenly flashed and disappeared. In an instant, darkness swallowed everything, and the eerie face silently evaporated from his sight. Chen Ze stared at the window, his chest heaving violently, his legs trembling. "If I don't find out the truth, I'll surely disappear like Xiaofeng and Jiaba." Finally, Chen Ze reached out with a trembling hand and pushed open the shabby factory door. By now, he was already tortured by fear, his face pale and his eyes empty. The air inside the factory was extremely cold, with a smell of decay. The light inside the factory was dim. The shabby walls were mottled with traces of dampness, and a thin layer of dust floated in the air. Chen Ze leaned over to look at the window in the distant corridor. There was no one in front of it. The thick dust on the ground seemed to have accumulated for years, but there were no footprints on the ground in front of the window, as if no one had ever stood there. His heart was pounding, and he slowly walked towards the window. Suddenly, the tripod made a crisp sound, which was particularly piercing in the dead silence of the factory, and startled Chen Ze. He raised his foot to look at, and saw that it was a pair of glasses that someone had dropped there, and he had stepped on it and shattered it. He ignored it, taking a deep breath and raising a trembling hand to the window frame in front of him. His fingertips touched the cold glass, sending a shiver through him. But in that instant, the light outside the window suddenly flickered, and through it, he saw a scene that sent chills down his spine. Outside, on the weedy path, another Chen Ze stood there, his eyes wide open, staring at him in terror, his face a look of unconcealed terror. As they stared at each other through the window, Chen Ze's mind went blank, his breath practically stagnating. The Chen Ze standing outside the window was trembling all over, his face pale, his lips trembling slightly, as if he were desperately searching for words. Then, Chen Ze heard himself outside the window finally speak, his voice trembling so much it almost broke. "Who are you?" The next morning, residents discovered the factory's iron gates wide open. Several police cars were parked outside, their sirens piercing the morning silence. Several officers entered and exited, their faces solemn. People stood in the distance, watching and whispering. They knew another child had disappeared, the third in the town to vanish without explanation. To uncover the truth, the police searched the factory's archives, and eventually found the phone number of the former factory owner, Mr. Lee. However, it wasn't Mr. Lee on the other end. Are you mistaken? My father disappeared a long time ago and hasn't been home in all these years.